Ah, the Habsburgs, Europe's longest-running family soap opera, complete with crowns, cousins, and more jawlines merging than a medieval family tree should allow. Forget Netflix's Bridgerton. The real binge-worthy scandal was Vienna's imperial palace, where political marriages doubled as awkward family reunions. Before we untangle this incestuous web of tiaras and tragedy, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, are you watching from a gilded ballroom or just your bedroom at some questionable hour? The Austrian Habsburgs weren't just rulers, they were the poster children of what happens when keep it in the family stops being advice for the bakery business and starts being royal policy. Their family motto may as well have been, "Why import a spouse when you can marry your cousin?" It was economical, sure, but it also turned their genetic pool into a puddle. Take Charles II of Spain, the poor product of too many Habsburg unions. By the time he stumbled onto the throne, his family tree looked less like a majestic oak and more like a tangled Christmas wreath. The man's jaw was so famously oversized it could have had its own postal code. Courtiers whispered, pamphleteers mocked, and modern historians still debate how he managed to chew without divine intervention. But incest wasn't just an accident, it was strategy. For centuries, Habsburg marriages were less about romance and more about empire building. Austria to Spain, cousins married. Austria to Bohemia, cousins again. By the 1600s, it was less matchmaking and more copy-paste. Imagine a Tinder app that only showed you relatives. Every left swipe was also a family insult. And then came the scandals. Vienna's court was a paradox, rigid etiquette by day, whispered bedroom intrigues by night. Mistresses paraded in silk gowns while archduchesses looked the other way, unless of course they had their own lovers hiding behind velvet curtains. Satirical pamphlets spread across Europe mocking the Habsburgs' double lives. One woodcut even showed an emperor clutching both a Bible and a courtesan, captioned, "Faith on Sunday, pleasure on Monday." Even Empress Maria Theresa, famous for being pious and producing 16 children, couldn't keep her court scandal-free. Her daughters were married off across Europe like human chess pieces, but the gossip in Vienna was far spicier. Tales of secret pregnancies, forbidden liaisons, and royal bastards circulated faster than the waltz. Vienna's streets were less city of music and more city of murmurs. And the people? Oh, they relished it. Gossip wasn't just idle chatter, it was currency. Pamphleteers grew rich selling stories of Habsburg infidelities, and satirists had a field day with caricatures of emperors caught with courtesans. It was Europe's earliest form of tabloid journalism, with every scandal feeding both laughter and outrage. The irony, of course, was how the Habsburgs clung to Catholic morality in public, while their bedrooms resembled a carnival. Sermons rang with calls for chastity, while palace corridors echoed with the shuffle of silk slippers after midnight. If hypocrisy were an Olympic sport, the Austrians would have taken gold every year from 1278 to 1918. So next time you see a portrait of a Habsburg emperor looking all stern and dignified, remember, behind that powdered wig was a family tree more twisted than their chandeliers. And trust me, we've only scratched the gilded surface. The ones dripping with scandal. Because nothing says imperial dignity like emperors and archduchesses trying to balance rosary beads with their extracurricular activities. Let's start with Maximilian I, the so-called last knight. His public image was of a noble warrior, defender of Christendom, and an all-around medieval action figure. But in private, his love life had more episodes than a telenovela. Widowed early, he developed a fondness for keeping mistresses, usually widows of courtiers who just so happened to be very available. Courtiers joked that Maximilian had a talent for comforting the grieving, usually in bed, usually before the funeral flowers had wilted. Then there's Emperor Rudolf II, the Habsburg who turned Prague Castle into a wonderland of oddities, alchemy labs, exotic animals, and of course, his very own collection of mistresses and male favorites. His contemporaries whispered that Rudolf treated his court less like a royal palace and more like an ongoing masquerade ball with a dress code of "come scandalous" or "don't come at all." While official portraits showed him in shining armor, satirical prints painted him in bed with both genders, a goblet in one hand and a horoscope in the other. And let's not forget the courtesans. Vienna's palaces had more of them than a Netflix casting call. Courtesans weren't just lovers, they were unofficial advisors, spies, and sometimes professional blackmailers. They traded secrets the way brokers traded stocks, and many of them grew wealthier than the noblemen they entertained. In fact, a few scandals suggest that courtesans had more say in certain treaties than the emperors themselves. Forget diplomacy at the table, try diplomacy under the sheets. Of course, the hypocrisy never failed to dazzle. Publicly, the Habsburgs condemned sin and immorality with all the thunder of Catholic sermons. Privately, their bedrooms looked like auditions for a particularly risque opera. Ministers thundered from pulpits about purity, while the same men paid hush money to mistresses tucked away in cozy Viennese apartments. And the pamphleteers? Oh, they thrived. Nothing sold faster in Vienna than a gossip pamphlet dripping with insinuations about the imperial family. Caricatures mocked Maximilian's romantic comforting, while crude woodcuts showed Rudolph in compromising positions with courtiers and courtesans alike. These weren't just gossip sheets, they were survival kits for a city addicted to schadenfreude. Meanwhile, the common people, caught between sermons and scandals, played along. On Sundays, they listened to priests thunder against sin. By Monday, they were chuckling at pamphlets that depicted those same priests sneaking into brothels. Vienna may have been a city of music, but it was also a city of double standards, and the Habsburgs set the tone. The Austrian Habsburgs may have ruled for centuries, but their bedrooms ruled the gossip columns. And the irony? Half their empire was built on moral order, while the other half was busy breaking it. Next, we'll see how those scandalous bedsheets reached beyond Vienna and nearly unraveled Europe itself. By now you've met the emperors who consoled widows and the ones who collected lovers like they were rare coins. But the Habsburgs were just warming up. Because if there's one thing they excelled at, other than bad chins and worse diplomacy, it was turning scandal into family tradition. Take Charles VI, the emperor who insisted his daughter Maria Theresa should inherit his crown. While Europe wrangled over succession rights, Charles himself was busy keeping mistresses discreetly funded in Vienna apartments. His family values speeches had the sincerity of a modern politician caught on Tinder. Courtiers joked that his real succession crisis was deciding which mistress to visit first. And then came Maria Theresa herself. Officially, she was the model Catholic mother. 16 children, endless sermons about morality, a personal war against brothels. Unofficially, let's just say her court was a hotbed of whispered affairs, and her ministers didn't always practice the purity she preached. Satirical pamphlets painted her not as mother of the nation, but as mother superior of hypocrisy, guarding the empire's virtue, while her courtiers slipped through palace corridors like actors in a bawdy play. Meanwhile, her son Joseph II decided to outdo them all. Nicknamed the People's Emperor, he promoted tolerance, reduced censorship, and reformed the legal system. Admirable, yes, but Joseph also had a notorious eye for women, especially actresses. Theater in Vienna became less about Shakespeare and more about who's the emperor dating this week. His late-night visits to actresses' apartments were so well known that gossipers claimed theater tickets should come with a warning, contains imperial involvement. And what of the ordinary Viennese? They loved it. Every affair, every dalliance, every contradiction between sermon and bedroom became fuel for the city's gossip machine. Pamphlets flew through the streets faster than pigeons, mocking emperors as lovesick schoolboys and courtesans as secret prime ministers. Public morality was supposed to be sacred, but in reality, scandal was the empire's favorite entertainment subscription, renewed daily. The irony was breathtaking. On Sundays, the Habsburgs championed chastity, piety, and discipline. By Mondays, their courtiers were arranging trysts behind cathedral walls. Ministers lectured the people on sin while slipping coins to courtesans. If hypocrisy was an Olympic sport, the Austrian court would have swept the medals. And let's not forget the foreign ambassadors. They reported back to Paris, London, and Madrid with tales less about treaties and more about trysts. Some even wrote that negotiating with the Habsburgs required less diplomacy and more discretion, not at the table, but in the bedroom. European politics, it seemed, had a pillow talk component no textbook dares to mention. The Habsburgs ruled an empire on discipline, faith, and family values, yet their bedrooms looked like casting calls for a very risque opera. In the next part, we'll see how those scandals didn't just embarrass Vienna, they nearly destabilized the entire European order. If you thought hypocrisy was the Habsburg family motto, wait until we arrive at the late 18th and 19th centuries, where their scandal game went global. The empire wasn't just exporting armies and treaties anymore. Oh no, it was exporting gossip, whispered across embassies, traded in salons, and immortalized in pamphlets, more popular than today's celebrity tabloids. Take Francis I, husband of Maria Theresa. Officially, he was the dull counterpart to her moralistic rule. Unofficially, his passion for alchemy and discreet lovers made him less a boring emperor and more a proto-mad scientist with benefits. One French ambassador remarked that Francis spent more time in chemical experiments than in bed with his wife. By chemical, of course, he meant the kind that wore perfume and silk corsets. Then came Leopold II, Maria Theresa's other son. He inherited Tuscany before Vienna, and Tuscany was, well, let's call it the empire's bachelor pad. Rumors of orgies, masquerades, and philosophical experiments followed him north. Vienna's gossips claimed that when Leopold became emperor, half of Florence breathed a sigh of relief, while Vienna's courtesans popped open champagne. And what about Francis II, later Francis I of Austria after the Holy Roman Empire collapsed? He was the man who faced Napoleon and lost more often than he'd like to admit. If Napoleon defeated him on the battlefield, Francis made up for it in the bedroom, reportedly keeping mistresses even while arranging dynastic marriages. His household was so chaotic that his own children whispered jokes about which half-brothers were technically legitimate. The chaos didn't stop there. The 19th century Viennese press exploded with satire. Caricatures of the Habsburgs as overfed cuckolds and scandalous libertines circulated widely. Citizens devoured them like we scroll memes today. One biting cartoon showed Francis II clasping a crucifix with one hand while holding a courtesan's garter in the other. Subtlety was not a Viennese speciality. But perhaps the most tragic comic of them all was Emperor Ferdinand I. Known as Ferdinand the Benign, he was plagued by epilepsy, developmental issues, and a stammer, hardly the poster child for a powerful dynasty. And yet even Ferdinand's court was not without its sexual farces. Courtiers whispered that the emperor's advisors arranged discreet visits to ensure he could at least appear virile. Vienna's pamphleteers were merciless, sketching him as a confused boy-king surrounded by scheming courtesans. By the mid-1800s, scandal at the Habsburg court was no longer whispered, it was practically published in installments. Aristocrats treated the emperor's love life the way modern audiences treat reality TV, with equal parts disgust and obsession. And just when Vienna thought it had seen enough, the younger Habsburg princes stepped onto the stage, blending courtly intrigue with personal recklessness. Affairs with actresses, dalliances with dancers, and more than one illegitimate child ensured that the empire's reputation remained, how shall we say, professionally scandalous. The Habsburgs had survived wars, revolutions, and Napoleon, but their greatest battle was against self-restraint. And spoiler alert, restraint lost every single time. Next up, we'll discover how those reckless affairs spiraled into political crises that made Europe itself blush. Enter Franz Joseph I, the emperor who reigned for nearly 70 years. On paper, he was the very model of a dutiful monarch, disciplined, orderly, practically allergic to fun. But in private, his marriage to the glamorous Empress Elizabeth, or Sisi, was as frosty as the Alps she loved to escape to. While Franz Josef was busy working 14-hour days and enforcing imperial etiquette, Sisi was galloping across Europe, chasing poets, horsemen, and more than one illegitimate child that scandalized doctors. Franz Josef himself, his escape came in the form of discreet visits to the actress Katharina Schratt. Officially, she was his close friend. Unofficially, she was his emotional mistress. Court gossip claimed the emperor spent more time at her villa than with his wife, and Sisi herself supposedly encouraged it, preferring her freedom over a faithful husband. Imagine a royal marriage where the emperor's mistress and empress shared polite tea. Vienna was shook. But the real crown jewel of disaster was Crown Prince Rudolf, Franz Josef and Sisi's only son. If ever there was a walking scandal wrapped in a military uniform, it was him. Rudolf had a taste for politics, radical ideas, and even more radical bedroom habits. Vienna salons buzzed with tales of his affairs with actresses, aristocrats, and more than one Parisian courtesan. It all came crashing down in 1889 at the infamous Mayerling incident. Rudolf and his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera, were found dead in a hunting lodge, an apparent suicide pact. The imperial court tried to bury the truth, but Europe's gossip machine roared louder than a printing press at midnight. Pamphlets, caricatures, and whispered rumors spread like wildfire. Was it murder, madness, or simply the most melodramatic lover's ending since Romeo and Juliet? Either way, the Habsburg dynasty was humiliated. The Mayerling scandal was so shocking that priests debated whether Rudolf should even be buried in consecrated ground. Nobles whispered about cursed bloodlines. Ordinary Viennese wagged their tongues, saying the empire had rotted from within. It wasn't just the death of a crown prince. It was the public exposure of a dynasty whose private vices could no longer be hidden. And if Rudolf's fall wasn't enough, his relatives kept the scandal supply chain running. Archdukes and princesses alike indulged in affairs, gambling, and marriages that looked more like social experiments than dynastic strategy. In one especially juicy case, Archduke Otto, Rudolf's cousin, was infamous for seducing women, losing fortunes at cards, and riding carriages through Vienna half-naked just for the thrill. Viennese fanatists had a field day. Cartoons showed the imperial crown sliding off drunken heads, pamphlets mocked the emperor's stiff moral image, and cafes buzzed with debates over whether the monarchy could survive another scandal. It was as if the empire's downfall was scripted by a playwright with a very dark sense of humor. By the turn of the 20th century, the Habsburgs weren't just Europe's most powerful dynasty. They were also its most lampooned. Every affair, every indiscretion, every whispered liaison was splashed across caricatures and gossipy pamphlets, ensuring that even as the empire crumbled, its scandals remained immortal. The Habsburgs couldn't win against Napoleon, nationalism, or even basic biology, but they never failed to win headlines for their scandals. And in Part 6, we'll see how these final disasters made sure the dynasty's end was less royal and more ridiculous.